In a land of unsolvable rich-poor gaps, we think it's especially problematic that individuals like Donald Trump own Trump Tower, glide down escalators every day, speak about how they're going to run for president of the United States, complain ludicrously about Mexicans. But sadly, ladies and gentlemen, we think a world in which he cannot pass his land onto his grandchildren, his children, is a better world for all of us. And that's exactly why we on Team Proposition today are extremely proud to propose a motion that land should not be owned permanently. So what are we exactly talking about in today's debate? Our policy is extremely simple. We're not going to allow land to continue to be static, allow it to be passed on from generation to generation. But we're going to make sure that you give the appropriate price amounts for that land, because we think that that's going to be more dynamic but less static, and therefore decrease the kind of inequality, and that's within the reach of what the government has the ability to do. So we think that especially problematic when individuals like Mitt Romney characterize this debate as a debate on farmers and farmers allowing themselves to pass on their land to their children. We don't think this debate is a debate about whether or not farmers should be able to pass on their land to their children. We think rather they're less than 1/10 of a percentage point. We think that the main debate today is on how the rich individuals can continue to pass on their land to the individuals, to their children, and in many cases, the current land that is being owned was owned by great-great-great-grandparents. So in that case, we think that land is especially important in this case. We have 3 arguments to present to you today. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why government has the necessity and the duty to intervene, especially on how it has justification. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why land is so specific to income inequality and perpetuates this kind of income inequality even more than stocks in the stock market or regular cash sums that they have. Thirdly, my Deputy Prime Minister, Lauren, is going to come up here and talk about how this will increase the incentive to work both for rich people and poor people. So, moving into our first argument on why the government has the obligation and the duty to interfere and why it has that kind of a unique justification. We think that we live in a society today where there is an increasing rich-poor gap. The Gini coefficient has increased over the past decade and is continuing to increase because partly due to this policy. We think this is inherently unfair. Why is this? It's because of something called the birth lottery. The birth lottery necessarily says that you don't choose where you're born, you don't choose who you're born to, you don't choose who your parents are going to be. They may very well be a wealthy person who owns a bunch of land, or you may very well be a poor person who doesn't own that much land or not in that great of a place. So we think that especially problematic. Seeing as the government, we're not today talking up here about communism, but we think in the status quo, this is especially problematic because the government is the best actor to deal with the situation. Why is the government the best actor to deal with this kind of land reform? We think that in the cases of progressive taxation and inheritance taxes, the government already actively takes steps to break up this kind of income inequality that's perpetuated under the model of opposition side. And we think that they need a needling factor. They need to continue this kind of working to make sure that to ensure that kind of social mobility, because only when there is that social mobility can government ensure that everybody within that country has the ability to reach their dreams. Ladies and gentlemen, we on Team Proposition side do not inherently disagree with inequality. We disagree with inequality that is A, not able to be broken up in any sufficient manner, and B, we also disagree with inequality that actually decreases the living standards of the very poorest individuals to an extent in which you can't live there in the first place. So in that way, we think that government is not only the best actor, but the actor that can understand that the most, because this kind of economic inequality harms us the most. And ladies and gentlemen, we think that this is especially important because the government wouldn't be doing its duty if it weren't breaking up these kinds of lands, because you can lose stock and you can lose these kinds of things much more easily. Which moves us on to our second argument on why is land so unique in this case, and why not stock market stocks. Shares. So why not kind of cash sums that you go on and you pay an inheritance tax? We think that the answer to this is extremely simple. It goes back all the way to the Middle Ages when you had the Crusades, and when individuals owning fiefs would pass on their lands to their children as well. And we think that that's exactly the case, because back in those days, there was a lot of social stratification. And there was social stratification for a reason, because peasants couldn't possibly hope to own land because they simply work for another individual who owns that land. It didn't matter how smart you were as a peasant, it didn't matter how hard you worked, you were going to have to work for somebody else under their land. We think that's exactly what's happening in the status quo. It's a socially stratified society in which people who own land have to be so dumb to give up that land. We think that it's different in cases of stock and money value, because when you are a rich person who are extremely stupid with your stocks and money, it's so much more easier to give up that land, give up that money, and give up that stock. But seeing as there are no points of information from Team Opposition today, let's furthermore talk about why the status quo is especially problematic again. Because the fact of the matter is that if, for example, you discover that the land you owned, that your great-great-great-grandfather owned, was full of oil, ladies and gentlemen, we think that in those cases, that's especially problematic because you didn't have anything to do with it. You were just lucky enough to be born in that way. So we think in that way, land is especially that way because land was here since the beginning of Earth, and so you are benefiting from that when you shouldn't really be benefiting, and it doesn't do anything with merit because you can't really do something better with that land, or you can't do something worse with that land. Whether or not the land appreciates or depreciates in value is not up to what you do, whereas in the stock market, you can sell those stocks because you can predict that thing. We think that it's less with the land market. So ladies and gentlemen, we also think that land never changes in this case, and you can't do that. And so we also tell you it's especially the government's duty that they do that. Why is that? For especially land. We think that in the cases of land, because there is a finite amount of land within a nation, we think it's especially different like that. Why is that? It's because in cases like stock, there's not a lump of labor. You can continually grow your stock market. You can continually increase the amount of jobs with things like immigrants. You can continually grow that kind of economy. You can continually grow the amount of money. Whereas in the case of land, ladies and gentlemen, that's completely not the case. You are a nation, and unless you are a crazy Russia and try to annex other nations' property, you're not going to be able to get more of land. And so, especially because it's the nation's finite resources, the government has a unique ability. We already see this with the United States of America and the Fifth Amendment, and we already see in cases like eminent domain, where the government has the ability to pay you for your land and get a fair price for it. Why is that? It's because land is finite, and when the government needs to do something with that land, because it's so finite, they have the unique ability to do that. So what does this second argument ultimately come down to? I've told you on the second argument why in the case, because land is so finite for that government, why it's especially important. And I've also told you that land is especially static and unique because those individuals don't necessarily always give up, unless you are extremely stupid, you're not going to be able to do much harm to that land. So what have I told you in my arguments today? I've told you two things. I've told you why the government has the inherent justification to intervene in these cases and why the rich-poor gap is especially increased under their model. Secondly, I've also told you under why land is so unique, and because land is so finite, why it's so imperative that the government has this obligation. And for all those reasons, because we don't believe in an unsolvable rich-poor gap, and because we think that the first step in ensuring social mobility for all citizens of a certain nation is through this kind of a policy, we're extremely proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. Let's now call upon Leader of Opposition.
So ladies and gentlemen, it's interesting. The previous speaker, he came up and talked about Donald Trump. How he's able to own these very tall skyscrapers, these buildings, able to go up and down the elevators all day and talk about how he's going to be able to run for president. And we see that Donald Trump is able to do that because he has put in a lot of effort, a lot of time into collecting resources, into gaining affluence, right? And we see that one of the biggest reasons he did that Perhaps perhaps the largest reason he did this act and decided to invest so much time and effort into gathering affluence, into buying these huge amounts of land, is because of his children. Right? He cared about the later generations that would come after him. He cared for their well-being, and these are one of the most biggest motivations that motivate our members in the society today to work harder and do their job and perform their task with diligence, right, with hard work and effort. And we believe that this is one of the most biggest values in capitalism society, and this is why we are proud to oppose this motion today. So with that being said, let me just dive right into a rebuttal of the previous speaker. So previous speaker has come up. He told us about how the government has the duty to intervene. Right? He said that because there is so much land that is being inherited currently, and it's all about the birth lottery, eugenic lottery, and because these individuals really had no say in how much land they were going to inherit, we see that the inheritance of land has led to a bigger rich-poor gap. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that this rich-poor gap still exists to a certain extent, at a much large extent, even if we erase the factor of land in the process, right? Even if we actually confiscate the land from these individuals after their parents have died, right? And we actually prevent the inheritance of land, we see that other resources are going to be inherited. There is still going to be a birth lottery. There is still going to be a genetic lottery. And we see that with land, there is not much that an individual can actually utilize. We believe that the more effective, the resources that affect a person's genetic lottery or birth lottery the most is in terms of money, it's in terms of funds, actual money and resources, rather than simple land, rather than how many square meters of land in the middle of the city your parents gave you, right? We believe that there are much more bigger factors that are at the issue here. And we believe that before actually moving on to land and trying to erase the inheritance of land in today's society, the proposition, we'll have to work on mending these other issues and trying to prevent the inheritance of these bigger resources that actually do affect birth lottery at a large scale. Secondly, they talked about why land is so specific. Now, they told us first of all about stock and money. Right? They say that land is very different from this because stock and money, depending on that individual's certain choices, right? It's easy to give up this type of resources. However, land, it's not so easy for these individuals to give up, no matter how dumb or how wrong their decisions are. Stock and money is much more easier to give up compared to land. Now we see that there is no actual support here, right? Because we believe that land is also a resource that can be confiscated from you, that sometimes you will lose when you make the wrong decisions, right? We believe that we see this in many cases, right? We see these rich people who have been so affluent, and because of the wrong choices they make in terms of businesses, in terms of their business decisions, right? They are forced to sell the resources and the wealth and the affluence they have. And one of the first things that they sell is the land that they have left over. And we see that in this process, land is also a resource that is very easy to get rid of, a resource that is very easy to sell, right? So we see a problem there. Second of all, they talked about how the government has a finite amount of land and how there is a system in the government where they will pay you enough money and persuade you and force you to give the money to give the land that you have to the government for the use of the government, right? For the use of the public good. So the opposition has recognized the fact that the current status quo, where the government does pay you rightfully, right, the amount of money that you deserve to give up your land, is perfectly adequate in the situation, right? The government still has the ability to acquire the amount of land that they need to do their work, and therefore we don't see a problem there as well, right? So with these two arguments out of the way, let me move on to our team signpost. We have 3 arguments for you today. First of all, we're going to be talking about property rights. Second of all, we're going to end on the values of capitalism society. Second of all, we're going to be talking about the problem-solution mismatch. And third of all, our second speaker is going to come up and he's going to explain to you the idea that preventional mechanisms still exist in the society to, prevent further genetic lottery or birth lottery. So, moving to my first argument, which is about property rights, right? So we see that... Sorry.
Whereas you can lose money through poor financial decisions, how can you lose land other than actively selling it?
Yes, so we see that because of these poor financial decisions, they have to make up for the money that they've lost. And in order to do this, one of the most disposable items that they have in their hands at their possession is land. And they sell this as a resource to gain money and make up for the monies that they lost. that they have lost. So our first argument is about property rights. We believe that one of the most biggest values of capitalism society is property rights. So why do we have property rights in the first place? Well, let's first talk about what property rights are, right? We want to make sure that people have the right to protect and utilize their assets, right? As long as, first of all, they've acquired them through paying the rightful amount of price that has been decided in the first place. Second of all, if they do have a certain purpose, they have assigned a certain purpose for that certain property, other than using that property to gain more and more money, right? So, for example, in the case of gambling, land and certain resources, we see that it's already banned by the law, right? So, because when these two requirements are met, then you do have a right to keep your property for no matter how long, the time is, and you have the ability to choose when you will sell this type of property, right? And we believe that that is fundamentally what a property right is. So why do we ensure these types of rights for people, right? It's because it motivates them. It gives them the idea that if I make enough money, if I work hard enough for my job, I will be able to gather enough affluence, enough resources to be able to buy these types of resources and acquire these types of assets. And because I have the ability to not sell at a certain time, I can, save up these types of resources, save it up for my children, for my later generations, so they will be able to prosper. So they will be able to live high quality lives. So these are one of the biggest reasons that members of the society today are motivated to work hard. Right? And we believe that by actually taking out this fundamental resource that can be inherited, we see that we are going to take out a fundamental source of incentive, fundamental source of motivation for these members of society to work hard in their positions, work hard and serve their duties. Right? So we see that there is a problem in their policy. Right? So moving on to my second argument, which is about a problem-solution mismatch. So, ladies and gentlemen, they've already told us that people, these people who have been inherited this type of land, they have not been working hard enough, they haven't worked or paid in terms of effort or time in order to acquire these resources, and they have to pay a price in order to gain these resources rightfully. And we see that that's already happening in the status quo. But we see that when this type of land or resource is inherited to these people, we pay inheritance tax, right? We see that these people are forced to pay a certain amount of money to actually acquire that certain type of asset from their parents, right? Not to an amount that they have to buy that asset again, but to an amount as to, actually show to the public and to the society that they have paid a certain price to acquire that asset. And we believe that by actually making these people pay in terms of inheritance tax, we do actually ameliorate some of the effects of the birth lottery, right? We weaken it to a certain extent, whereas people who have been wealthy enough, who have been born with a silver spoon, are given these types of privileges, and at the same time pay for what they get from their parents. And because of this, please vote beside opposition. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. Okay, let's now hop on back to Congress.
Here's what I'm going to do in my speech. I'm going to first tell you some of the mischaracterizations that we've heard from opposition about land itself. Because all we've heard from team opposition was assertions after assertions. The proposition is going to give you a plausible model of what is actually happening in our status quo. Then secondly, I'm going to rebut more broadly in the context of what is the property right and how that property right does not apply in this motion, especially for land. And then thirdly, I'm going to tell you my argument about productivity and incentives, which is a direct rebuttal to the second argument from team opposition. So let's jump right into the characterization that I want to begin with. Although my Prime Minister has already done an excellent job, there were three mischaracterizations that we've heard from team opposition. Firstly, they told us that land is just squared miles. Just squared miles, ladies and gentlemen. Just squared miles that give you million tons of oil, or squared miles that will may as well be like New York, Times Square, or very great and famous profitable lands, which can be giving money for these people for millions, or not millions, but hundreds of years and posterities afterwards. And therefore, it's not just square miles, these are very valuable lands that people want to hold on to even until the end. Second, they said that it could actually be easily used and be sold off, and they gave us the contention that stocks are just like lands and therefore can be easily used. There's a huge difference between stocks and lands, and we've already heard from Prime Minister in this explanation. Why so? Because, ladies and gentlemen, stocks, as we've seen in the history and even in the status quo, isn't going up and down continuously. We've seen the stock market crash. We've seen the stock market also go up. We think that is a continuous trend, and people have to study in order to make sure that they're also selling and buying stocks in a more appropriate manner. On the other hand, what happens with lands? People don't necessarily have to study land as rigorously as stocks, because even if it's in a very horrible situation, that land in 10 years and 20 years will be able to be renovated, and even if not renovated, will still have a value. It will be able to be used as a restaurant land. It will be able to be used as even a mining land. It will be able to be used as a productive manner. We think that the land will have a continuous and a static productivity for all these people, which is why the rich people want to continuously hold on to the lands, right? We think that they buy stocks because it gives them a chance to have huge amount of money at one time. But what do we have with lands? Lands is something that is immobile, something that you can keep forever. And let's move on to the third characterization that we've also heard from team opposition. You know what? People just sell lands if there is bankruptcy. It's so easy to sell lands. We don't think so. In the status quo, even the rich people will want to keep the lands until the end, because even if their companies crash, what will happen? What is the worst case scenario for these landowners? These people are going to be unemployed. These people will have no money even if their companies go bankrupt, but they will be able to have lands, and from those lands they can build up. We think there is a huge discretion between what team opposition paints of what lands are and what proposition paints it as. And so let's move on to the rebuttal that I want to give into team opposition, right, about the property right. We think that the main argument from team opposition was that, you know what, people have worked so hard in order to get these lands. They deserve it. That's all the assertions that we've heard from team opposition. We tell you that we think that these people do deserve this money. They deserve the lands, they deserve the money. However, why should the posterity, the child, the son and the daughter, who has done nothing in the contribution of his work, also have a huge birth lottery? We think that the government's role is to make sure that everyone has a standard of living and everyone has a certain level in order to have their own welfare. In the status quo, however, because the rich and poor gap continues to be drastically enlarged, the poor people continue to stay in the pit hole while the rich people continue to go up. And why does this trend continue? Because the rich people, the families of rich people, and the families afterwards continue to hoard all the money, while the poor people, unable to see the money being circulated, cannot have the money at all for themselves. Which leads right on to the third argument that we have from team proposition. We think that this third argument is hugely important, one, because it's a rebuttal to the second argument with team opposition, but secondly, because it tells us that the society in itself can be hugely affected by this motion, right? Productivity and incentives. Now, the government's role, as my Prime Minister has told you, is to make sure government's role is to make sure that everyone has a welfare and everyone has a standard of living. But it goes further than that. We have to make sure that people's lives are being continuously enhanced, which means that we need people, not just the rich, not just the poor, but everyone has to work in contribution. Because although Jiwon may have been born in a huge rich family, he may have been the son of Samsung, and Nick may have been the son of a farmer. But it's a birth lottery, ladies and gentlemen. And what is the government supposed to do? What is the role of the government? It is to mediate between the two and make sure that Nick also has to climb up. We're not saying that Jiwon has to go down and live like Nick, but we think that Jiwon, who has had that birth lottery, that advantage that no other person had, also has the responsibility to contribute to the society, a society that's given him so much back. And therefore, we think that the government's duty is to enhance the lives of everyone. And therefore, we would like to argue this in mainly two subcategories, right? How we incentivize the rich, and secondly, how we also incentivize the poor. First, ladies and gentlemen, how do we incentivize the rich? Prime Minister already told you that land is static, and we need to make sure that people are continuously building up and that people are continuously contributing back to society in this manner. Because once land is static, once the rich does not pay back, once the rich does not contribute to our society, what happens? We don't think that the education, the welfare, the money that we need for the government can be contributed back to our society. Meaning that a Saudi Arabian oil prince will continue to be a Saudi Arabian oil prince. He will continue to hoard all the money, but will he really pay it back to the government? No. We think that this person will try to use his money for all of his posterity and keep all the money left after he's used it for his sons. We think that the money builds up only in the pockets of the rich, leaving nothing for the poor. And therefore, that leads to the question, then what happens to the poor, right? We think that by government taking in the lands from the rich people, even if the rich people can buy the lands back, we think that the sum of the money of the rich actually goes into the pockets of the government. And we think that in that sequence and in that step, we allow the government to be more empowered, we allow the government to be a true mediating factor between the rich and the poor. And in that aspect, ladies and gentlemen, does the opposition have any point of information? Seeing none, I want to move on to the second sub-point, which is also about the poor, because we think that the poor is also an important factor. In the status quo, ladies and gentlemen, if I was a very poor person, as much as I work hard, I can never be the son of Samsung. I can never be the son of Samsung, or I mean, of course, I can't be the son of Samsung. I can never be the daughter of Samsung, right? Which is why we think that it is most important to make things more and less authoritative. In the status quo, what does the rich do? Rich controls everything, ladies and gentlemen. For example, in South Korea, there is a myth that every meter you go through in Apgujeong is owned by one person, like CJ or Samsung, right? We think that the status quo has to change, that the government has to take an active role and participation in breaking up these lands, and even if they can't take it back, they have to have some compensations for it. Because that Samsung man who created Samsung may have done a huge work for it, but what did the child do? Nothing. He doesn't even get education, he doesn't have the right or the responsibility to take care of the future of South Korea. And we think that the same law applies to all the families that we have all around South Korea and all around the world, which is why we think that the rich has more responsibility than the poor, and therefore we think therefore permanently owned land should not be allowed. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. Let's now call upon Dear Lo.
So, listening to a speech made by Deputy Prime Minister, we have found out that they haven't, all the speech made by the government side haven't solved any problems that they identified. So, for example, they talked about how these their whole speech actually talked about how these gap between rich and poor should be solved, through their model. But we believe that there will be no difference. So, for example, let's talk about these rich people who have their land to inherit to their sons and daughters. So, what our Prime Minister, they have talked about people like Donald Trump who have a lot of land to inherit to their sons and daughters. But we believe that the lands that these people own, the value of the lands that these people own is not those kind of lands are not the lands that these poor people can buy, even if they don't inherit these lands. So, for example, let's think of Korea, where these rich people live. They live in places like Hannam-dong or Samsung-dong, or places where the value of these lands are so high. But even if they don't inherit these lands to their sons and daughters, we believe that the problem doesn't solve at all, because these poor people, they can't afford these lands. They can't afford these houses, which are about like several million, that cost about several million bucks. So we believe that this doesn't solve the problem at all. So then let's talk about those people of middle classes who own land to inherit people. So we believe that this only worsens the problem, because when we think of Korea, where our GDP is about $30,000. And when we think of our Korea's lands, which costs about $100,000, several $100,000, we believe that it takes about 10 years for each middle-class man to buy this land, because there are also fees that they use for other purposes. So we believe that this only worsens the situation between the gap between rich and poor is big, because all we say, what all politicians and all policies aimed at when we think of the gap between rich and poor, we believe that more middle classes, more production of middle classes will lead to this mitigation of the gap between rich and poor. But we believe that this will only reduce this middle class, because even if they work like 10 years, so hard to buy this house, so that they can actually give this house to their daughters and sons,
they cannot inherit their housings because of this policy made by the government. And finally, we can think of these poor people who luckily got their houses. So because thanks to Korean government system like 보금자리 주택 or like policies like that, there would be some bottom class people who also own land, who also own housings, so that they can inherit them to their sons and daughters. But we believe that this will also worsen the problem, even worse in this case, because they're actually getting these lands from these poor people because we shouldn't permanently own land. So we believe that this policy doesn't mitigate the problem at all, but worsens the problem. So they talked about how these people can climb up the gap between rich and poor, and how the government should make so much contributions to make them climb up this gap between rich and poor. But we believe that there are already so many contributions that government is making, which will be further elaborated by my substantive argument. And also they talked about how these rich people who there will be certain money coming to the government so that they can use. However, we believe that this is also wrong because when we think of rich people and poor people, who has more information? Of course, rich people. They have better lawyers. They have better contact to the news, and they have so many information inflow towards them. So we believe that even if this policy is implemented, the rich people can simply sell the land before they inherit them to their kids, daughters and sons, and they can just simply inherit them to their kids with another form of asset, which these kids will use to buy other lands. So we believe that this doesn't solve the problem at all. And we believe, as I have said before, the people who actually are given harm from this policy will be the middle class and the bottom class who own lands, because they are the ones who don't really know about policy. They are the ones who have limited inflow of information, because they're the ones who don't really have personal lawyers like people like David Trump, because Donald Trump. So we believe that they are the ones who will actually become being harmed from this policy, which means that their policy never actually solve the problem of the bigger gap between rich and poor, but only worsens it. So, moving on to my argument, I believe we'll talk about how prevention mechanisms already exist. So, we have, in our country, we have speculation and real estate to be illegal. So we have this policy because we don't want these people to buy land and not even live there or utilize the land for any purposes and then sell it back, because we don't want these people to make these to buy this land and just profit from them, but we want to protect those people who could actually really benefit from these lands. So we believe that prevention mechanism exists, and also we have heavy taxation for those people who have land, because we have taxation for every estates that people own. So we believe that because this taxation is based on the current value of the land, this can simply reflect the changing value of the lands, which can actually solve the problem also. And even more, we have when these rich people inherit their lands to their sons and daughters, we also make them pay high tax, which can also solve these problems. And even more, our Korean government kindly offers systems like 보금자리 주택, which can actually help and offer these poor people to actually be given these homes that they can offer. And even when we actually distribute new apartments, even when the Korean government distribute new apartments, they give priority to these poor people, which can actually have these bottom class people to actually earn those money and get those money to buy their land, or to even to lend the land to live in. So because of this, we believe that prevention mechanism already exists, and government is offering so many opportunities for these poor people to climb up the mountain, to climb up and become part of the middle class and to become part of the top class. We believe, and because we believe that this policy of permanently owning, not allowing people to permanently own land, the people who are receiving harm from this policy is not the rich people. But we believe that the people who are harmed from this policy are the middle class and the bottom class. So because we believe that this doesn't solve any of the problems the government themselves identified, we believe that we take this debate wrong. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. Now PowerPoint government rep.
Capitalism, ladies and gentlemen, may have been successfully euphemized by this team opposition today. But we say that nothing in this life is guaranteed. Although we agree upon the ideas of meritocracy, we see that the reason why this exploitation occurs in society in the first place is because the rich buy their way out of the system. That is the problem that we identified in the get-go of today's debate, and we will successfully provide the solution to that. We said capitalism only works if there is a level playing field, which was not provided by side opposition. Now today, we see that the deputy leader of opposition spent his nearly entire speech talking about ultimately two different things. Number one, there will still be exploitation because the rich will still convert this into other ways like money. But secondly, he talked about how there are other mechanisms or prevention methods in his third argument. But we see that both of these two things ultimately boils down to the fact that they have still provided no solution whatsoever. They accuse us for not being able to solve the poor and rich gap. And even under the worst case scenario, we still do a better job than them because we are at least trying to solve and alleviate the situation. But these are points that I'll be directly addressing within my classes. But we see that this debate ultimately boils down to two questions. So number one is the idea regarding justification. The line between meritocracy and the idea of when the government can actually step in and actually help the society. And number two is the idea regarding who promotes a more desirable society and analyzing the different stakeholders that are really involved. Whether it is the rich, whether it is the poor. And we will show you how it will help both, how it will incentivize both of these stakeholders and how we provide a more desirable society. So let's jump right into our first question. Does the government actually have a justification to enforce upon its policy? Now, you have to remember, judges, that the problem that we identified from the get-go of today's debate was that there is an inherent rich and poor gap that is constantly increasing. We see that this is occurring in societies, whether it's the US or Korea, but there must be a clear reason as to why this occurs. And we see that the ultimate, one of the biggest factors that is contributing to this problem is possibly the rich buying their way in things like land. There's no opportunity for the poor people to actually rise up the social ladder. We see that the government here, in this situation, is the actor that can alleviate the situation, because we see that it is the duty of the government to ensure the happiness of everybody. We see that it is not just ensure the happiness of the rich people. So we see that it is ultimately not a communistic type of line that we are advocating here, but we see that government's duty is in fact to provide happiness for everybody. But we see that even in the status quo, opposition has acknowledged that government does take measures in order to make this actually happen. We see that whether it is through progressive taxation or inheritance taxation, we see that the government is already taking certain measures in order to balance, in order to ensure happiness for everybody. So we see that if the government is already taking such measures, why is the government's role not being fulfilled under our case? We see that, to give a parallel example, what a side opposition is continuously advocating for today is the beauty of capitalism. But we see that this clearly does not work in certain examples like the Gilded Age in America. We see that businesses continuously dominate society, right? We see that corporations owned by the most wealthy 1% of the society, right, like Rockefeller, they buy their way out of the system. And this shows that capitalism clearly does not always work. And we see that the government, when during the Gilded Age, did not take any measures whatsoever. We see that the society only was further exploited, right? We see that this rich and poor gap was exacerbated. But we see that in this type of situation, it is the government's duty to actually step up and actually to break up this rich and poor gap, which is not being done inside opposition. Moreover, we see that DLO's ultimate speech was about this one point, about how the rich will then convert the land to money after selling it off and then still give it to the children. So that was the ultimate point that was trying to be advocated by the deputy leader of opposition. But we see that it seems like the opposition bench as a whole failed to realize the difference between this land and the difference between money, because that was a clear characteristic that was distinguished by the first two speeches as well. We see that to do a juxtaposition of money and land, the reason why a lot of the rich people don't, just when they are rich, stack up money behind their garage or behind their backyard, but rather actively use this money to buy things like paintings or buy things like land in this case, is because certain of these things are not fluctuating, right? We see that these type of products are static compared to money. We see that if there is an increased circulation of money within the economy, we see that money is something that can fluctuate so much, which is why we believe that land is so exclusively different compared to money, which is not a characteristic that was realized by side opposition. So we see that even under our scenario, we can actually make a good enough attempt to actually break this apart, because we see that the rich can no longer just rely on this very static measure to actually build up their income. No longer just sit behind their desks and watch their farms grow or watch Times Square continuously grow. We see that those are not options that are available for the table anymore, which is why it will be a good step to actually break apart this rich and poor gap. Any POIs from opposition? Well, seeing that there are none, we see that they do in fact agree to this idea of justification. But we see that last but not least, when the leader of opposition comes up and says, quote unquote, that Donald Trump has placed the amount of effort reached for later generations. The idea that they are exploring here is meritocracy. Then the ultimate question becomes where that actually government can actually infringe, right? Sure. We say that what we have been advocating for in today's debate is not communism, which is the total end of the spectrum. We told you that meritocracy is great, but we told you that when a very rich Donald Trump makes all of this money just to give it for his son, who will just give it to his grandson, we say that that is ultimately where the exploitation occurs in the first place. We ask the fundamental question of why does birth lottery have to determine the destiny and the posterity, right? And that was still a question that was not answered by the opposition bench. We tell you that it is inherently wrong that just because you were born in a rich family, you have the right to be lazy, and you have the right to just sit behind your desk and do nothing about it. When we see that the poor people are trying to make their way to actually have an opportunity to climb up their ladder, we see that when just because you were born well, you have the right to own huge sums of money. We believe that is not a message that the government should be promoting in the first place, which is why we win this clash of the government justification. Because we have shown you that the fine line exists on side government. We have shown you that the government does in fact have a right to just intervene. But let's, on a second clash, examine how this will promote a more desirable society. So we said the first clash that is actually involved is the rich. And we told you that there's inherent exploitation that is occurring. Because we see that the rich are clearly disincentivized to actually use up their money. We told you that the reason why this policy under opposition is especially harmful is because the rich are just sitting and doing nothing. We told you that they have no incentive to actually spend this money for the society in the first place. And that was a whole third argument that proposition has brought to you today, which is not clearly and adequately engaged to by the opposition bench. But the reason why this argument is so important is because we showed you that in order to form a more desirable society, the rich need to play their part as well. They can't just be inactive and be doing nothing, right? But we told you that when they, in terms of the poor as well, we told you that it benefits them because it seems like the deputy leader of opposition as well as the rest of the opposition are under an assumption that they cannot afford houses, quote unquote, or they cannot get land from the poor people. Anyway, but we see that when the government actually breaks up this land, this type of land is actually used to do things like build public infrastructures or build public works, which are far more better than actually being in the pockets of the rich people. So we said that even in the worst case scenario, even though the poor people may not be able to afford this land, in which the government will take good enough measures to do so, we see that at the very least there will be more public infrastructures. There will be more works that can give privileges to the poor people as well. And when they ask a fundamental question of there will be other mechanisms as well, we pose a question to them. Why can't this be part of that as well? If the rich and poor gap is not being eradicated, why can't this be a simple extension to what we are already doing in the status quo? Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. Let's now call for an opposition wave.
Ladies and gentlemen, from the Prime Minister's speech, when he started talking about Donald Trump and about his amazing, fabulous wealth, we have just heard how they well contextualized about the inequality exacerbated in the social status the status quo. But we have just heard it was only ended as a contextualization, but they weren't able to solve any of the contextualization of inequality that's happening. But in our model, we would like to prove why our case was different and will be able to prove this and will be able to solve and better, for the better well-being of the society as a whole. So, having that done, we would like to go over to our classes. First of all, we would like to prove why, in the first place, this policy isn't even justifiable. And second, even let's just say for the sake of the proposition it is justifiable, why it won't be able to solve the current existing inequality. First of all, why is it just not justifiable? Our wonderful LO has stood up in the study talking about the property rights and the basic fundamental rights and rights existing in the capitalist society. We have told you about property rights, about how they are established. We want to make sure that people have the right to protect and utilize their assets. We can concede to the fact that inequality exists and the government should work as an active actor to reduce it. But we think that the government shouldn't abuse their authority to take away the assets of the rich, but they should rather use other mechanisms to actually decrease the inequality directly heading towards these people who are suffering from the birth lottery. We also concede to the fact that birth lottery exists. But we don't think that just because birth lottery exists, we should take away all the assets that were given statically and permanently from these rich people, because we have to concede and we have to acknowledge the fact of the society that we are living in. We live in a capitalist society. We live in a society that we acknowledge property rights, private properties. And even though they may have been given from our ancestors, and even though I have not deserved it and I didn't do anything to deserve these rights, because we live and we've established this society up to a certain extent, we have to acknowledge these rights. But that doesn't mean the opposition side is just going to make this problem, inequality, existing as it's currently doing. So, we see that when the government wants to intervene into a certain right, especially when it's the right of property rights, which we consider to be a fundamental right of capitalism, we think that that has to be the last resort. We think that that has to be the only method to solve this problem. But we don't think so, because we see that we have already told you about how there are different mechanisms that actually are able to solve this problem. For example, progressive taxations, inheritance taxes. If we think that inheriting lands, inheriting assets of the rich is so problematic, then we should tax the people. The government should actually gather the inherited money and the assets through taxation, not just by taking away. So you just inherited your land from your ancestor, and I don't think that you deserve it, so I'm going to take it away. We don't think that that is a capitalist idea. We think that that's purely based on communist based idea, and we think that using progressive taxation or higher the inheritance tax will be a better way to actually promote this to reduce this inequality. We also think that when we want to solve this problem of inequality, we have to directly focus on to the poor. For example, we could give these poor people a different method of how they could earn ability to earn the land. Not just saying that not just providing a big, broad policy that affects the whole. And we're going to, in our second class, we're going to talk about how this will not be a significant problem to the rich, but actually a problem to the middle class and the poor class as a whole. So we told you about how it wasn't justifiable in the first place. People told you that in the fundamental right of property, when they want to intervene it, they have to be able to justify that that's the only method. But we think that that was not. And having that done, let's just say that for the sake of the proposition, it is the only way. But we don't think that it will be an efficient way, which is why it's going to be an efficient way. In our DPM and throughout our PM, we have told you that rich are not going to be the people who suffer from this policy. The people who suffer from this policy is actually going to be the middle class and the poor class. We have told us about how it will actually benefit the rich and poor because it gives growth incentive for them, but we don't think so. Because we think that if we just simply block people inheriting land, what the rich people just can do is that they will just change the land they exist to money and then inherit it. But what about people in the middle class who have worked 10, 20 years to actually earn that home? That's the only land that they have. That's the only home they have. We believe that that's the policy which actually significantly takes away the properties of those middle class and poor classes, not the rich people. So
So if we want to solve this problem efficiently under our model, we have to actually fix the structural problems existing in our society. For example,
Yeah.
as we have already told you, yes sir,
Even Adam Smith stated that capitalism requires a level playing field. When one person owns Times Square and another person has no land, how is that a level playing field?
yes, we didn't say that inequality should be left over, but we're going to use different methods about it. And they have told us again from an example of how peasants after the crusade, it was significant of land. But we don't think that land is that much significant in our current state. We don't think that people earn exactly money from their land, raising, harvesting crops or whatnot. We don't think that land is the main reason for these inequality processes. We think that there are different things, money, stocks, or whatnot. We think that these capitals are actually what leads to inequality. We think that if it's money and land itself is just a one-of-a-kind of an asset, not the main asset that the rich have. So just simply saying that I'm not going to inherit land is not going to solve the inequality, but it's only going to exacerbate the problem for the rich, middle, and poor. Then what will our policy do? We think that our policy from using progressive taxation, actually increasing inheritance tax, which is so low, and it will not reach inheritance tax. And we see that if you want to actually solve this problem, because we have already told you this policy is not going to affect the rich at all, we're going to use different methods of how these CEOs, top CEOs are fabulously paid. When the average income tax between the rich and poor is average 365 to 1. We think that that's the kind of ways where the government actually have to intervene, not just simply taking away the capitals, because we told you throughout we think that that's not going to solve the problem at all. They have also talked about how that's going to incentivize the rich and poor, but we don't think that it's going to incentivize at all in the first place, because we have already told you the rich are not going to be influenced at all, and the only thing that they're going to incentivize are the middle and poor people. And if we consider that when the government wants to reduce an inequality problem, we think that what we mainly have to focus is to giving power and giving more power to the middle and poor class, not just stressing out the rich class. That will affect more on the poor and middle class. So what did we tell you today? We told you why this policy wasn't justifiable in the first place. We told you that this was not the last resort, and because they were going against the property rights, we think that was totally not necessary, and even though it was necessary, it wasn't going to be efficient at all compared to our model. We think that the opposition side takes this space.
Thank you for your speech. Let's call for an opposition reply.
Now, it's been a long debate, ladies and gentlemen. So today, as the opposition reply speaker, I'm going to offer you a very easy way to sum up today's debate through a story, right? Let's take a look at two people of the same age. Yu-yeon, who is very rich, and Taeyeon, who is obviously very poor. Both of them are expecting children in a few months, right? Now, let's look at what happens under the proposition team's policy, right, to Yu-yeon and Taeyeon and their children, right? So first of all, let's take a look at Yu-yeon's case. First of all, because of this policy, she has been partially unmotivated because this policy sends her the message that some of the work that she did and the effort and time that she put into has, bear fruit, right? And it's turned into a certain type of assets, certain types of affluence, and she recognizes the fact that when land can't be inherited to her children, she is going to lose a certain amount of the affluence and wealth that was meant for her children in the first place, right? So she believes that her children can't, get and deserve the well-being and the high quality of life that is proportionate to the amount of effort that she put in. So she is unmotivated to a certain extent. But this doesn't really affect or impact her considerably or significantly, because what we see is that Yu-yeon can make the decision to transfer some of the land that she has into the form of money. Other methods, right, that actually allow her to transfer money to her children, right? So we believe that the rich and poor gap that the proposition has talked about is not really impacted. We believe that even in their scenario, in their policy, this rich and poor gap still exists, right? So for Yu-yeon, because land is one of many methods, and because there is still a lot of money and resources remaining for her children to get, even after she dies, it's okay for her, and it's okay for her children. Her children will still enjoy a very high quality of life, right? So we see that there is no significant impact to her well-being or her children's well-being. Third of all, we see that her rights, her property rights, are violated. Right? One of the most biggest values of capitalism society are violated. Because we see that even though she has paid the rightful price, right, the justified price in order to acquire these assets called land, she still has an obligation. The government still forces her to submit this land when she dies, right? And forces her children and denies her children of access to the land that her parents, their parents have so rightfully, acquired. And we see a problem there. So we see that, first of all, that her rights are violated. Second of all, she's unmotivated. And third of all, her children still maintain a high quality of life, which means that the rich and poor gap does not experience a certain impact, right? So let's take a look at poor Taeyeon, right? Poor Taeyeon, yes, they told us that through actually acquiring the money from selling land, the government can actually provide infrastructure and public goods for people like Taeyeon and improve his quality of life. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we see a problem there. Because already the government is doing this. The government, through collecting taxes, especially from the rich people like Ji-yeon, are already making significant progress in terms of acquiring this type of infrastructure and public goods for people like Taeyeon, right? For the poor people, right? To improve their quality of life and to perhaps give them a chance to succeed in society. So we see that that is enough, right? But we also see that not only is there no change in the policy in terms of the effects that go to poor people like Taeyeon, we also see that poor people like Taeyeon are negatively impacted. So we've already shown you today, through this debate, that for poor people like Taeyeon, or the middle class, right, land takes up a very significant asset, right, of inheritance that they give, that these middle class or lower classes give to their children. We believe that actually the value of the land that these people own is much more bigger than the amount of money and resources that they leave for their children when they die. So in the end, we see that the proportion of wealth that is taken from each party, rich people like you and poor people like Taeyeon, is different, right? And we see that the amount of wealth that is transmitted, the proportion of wealth that is taken away from the inheritance is much more bigger for the cases of the poor, the cases of the middle class, and not the rich. So we see that this policy actually has a reverse discrimination. It does actually give a larger negative impact to the poor, right? So through the story of rich Ji-yeon and poor Taeyeon, please understand the value of opposing this motion today. Please vote for side opposition. Thank you.
Thank you for the speech. Let's now call for government reply.
When team opposition comes up here and tells us we have magical other methods that are going to solve this kind of a problem, but we're not going to tell you what they are until our deputy leader of opposition, they sound suspiciously like Mitt Romney. Because that's exactly what Mitt Romney did. He said, I have a tax code plan that will fix our deficit and make sure our nation is a shining bastion for all immigrants come onto our nation. But ladies and gentlemen, that was extremely bad policy because that policy didn't take into account the fact that their policy and their alternative method that was given in their second speaker of an income tax goes against the very principles they talk about. Working hard, passing it on to your children. Income tax, that's gone. They talk about, oh, it's going to incentivize me to work harder, but that's going to be taxed. Okay, that principle is gone too. So every single method, ladies and gentlemen, has a kind of a weighing balance, and we think that this land tax is the best example. So I'm going to go on to the two worlds in proposition sites model. First, I'm going to ask about who understands land. Secondly, I'm going to talk about who helps social mobility. So what is in our world on land? We gave you 5 reasons why land is different from money. Number 1, we told you that land is finite within nation. And unless you're crazy Putin who takes over different countries' lands, you're not going to get any more land for that nation. Secondly, we told you that land is static. So unless you're extremely stupid, it's hard for you to lose that land because you have it for generations and you pass it on without that much of a tax. Thirdly, we told you it's especially hard for a poor person to get it because it's already owned. Fourth, we also told you that land keeps on earning you money, whereas money, you can't make money from money unless you're extremely smart on the stock market. Fifthly, Fifth, we are also talking about inflation and why land isn't affected by inflation as much. What's on their side? They sound like the NRA when they come up here and tell us that, oh, these people are going to take all of your stuff. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not the case. We're only taking this kind of land which perpetuates this kind of social inequality, and the only solution they gave you is a worse off solution that doesn't abide by the very principles that they talked about. But secondly, who helps social mobility? Because we ask you a question. Put yourself in a fantasy land where you're actually a rich person. Would you rather pass on to your children land or money? We think that you would rather pass on land because it's so much more easy for your child to continue to pass on that land generation after generation. It's much harder for that child to lose that land, as I've already given you in the first example. But let's talk about why their 3 assumptions about capitalism were wrong on their world. Because they prohibit social mobility. They said, quote unquote, you can work hard for that kind of money. But we think that when your great-great-great-grandfather is the one who had that land because of how he used slavery, we don't think that's the kind of thing the government should continue to allow to be passed on from generation to generation, and something you continue to profit off of, something that slave-owning families continue to profit off of. Secondly, they told you you can quote-unquote work harder. But ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about how ludicrous this is. Because you can't really work harder when it's you against Donald Trump's son who owns Times Square, ladies and gentlemen. It's impossible to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps when you don't have any bootstraps to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. And it's exactly this kind of thing. Yes, Donald Trump's, exactly what they've been saying all this throughout this debate is, yes, you might be having to compete with Donald Trump's son who owns about $5,000 a day just from the land he owns. But hey, if you scrub shoes hard enough, maybe you'll be able to own that $5,000 every day. And we think that that's the very problem on their case. Because they talk about, quote unquote, the beauty of capitalism. Ladies and gentlemen, the inventor of laissez-faire capitalism, Adam Smith, in his Wealth of Nations book, he specifically wrote, capitalism only works when you have a level playing field. Ladies and gentlemen, you can't have a level playing field when somebody earns $5,000 a day from the land he has. You can't earn that kind of capitalism when there's such an uneven playing field. And because our world is not a fantasy land, and somehow people who work harder without any bootstraps can pull themselves up by those imaginary bootstraps, and because we ensure that even if we protect the problem 1% from this, even if we solve the problem 1 to 2%, we are ever willing to make sure that this social mobility is able to be happening. Thank you.